Welcome to Sleepy Love Tales, soothing romantic stories to help you relax and fall asleep. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments. If soft, heartfelt tales help you unwind, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment of calm. Now, let's begin tonight's story. Steps Unfinished. The grand ballroom of the Kyiv Palace of Culture was a ghost of its former self, a cavern of fading Soviet-era grandeur where the ghosts of apparatchiks had been replaced by the fierce, nascent dreams of children. The air, thick with the scent of floor wax, rosin, and the faint, clean sweat of youth, was a tangible thing. Sunlight, the colour of pale honey, streamed through towering arched windows, catching the dust motes as they danced over the parquet floor like a galaxy of tiny captured stars. The mirrors that lined the walls were vast, but their silvered surfaces were tarnished at the edges, reflecting a slightly distorted, dreamlike version of the world within, a world of disciplined bodies and untamed ambitions. In this world, Anya, at 10, was a small, fierce flame. She was tiny for her age, a slip of a thing with a coil of dark hair pinned tightly at the nape of her neck and eyes that burned with a light far too old for her years. She danced with a desperate razor-sharp precision, each movement economical and perfect. Her family had sacrificed everything for these lessons. Her talent was their only currency, their only hope for a life beyond the grim grey blocks of their neighbourhood. Every extension of her leg, every arch of her back was a testament to their unwavering faith and her relentless drive. She was a lonely child, set apart by the intensity of her focus, a girl who understood sacrifice better than friendship. Dima, at 11, was her opposite. He was tall for his age, with a natural, languid grace that made him seem boneless. The weight of legacy rested on his slender shoulders. His parents were decorated champions, their medals and trophies lining the shelves of their apartment like a shrine to a glorious past. He felt the silent pressure of their expectations, the unspoken command to follow in their footsteps, to carry the family name to even greater heights. But his soul, the truest part of him, came alive only when the music began. In the heart of the melody there were no expectations, no legacies, only the pure, unadulterated joy of rhythm and movement. He too was lonely, trapped in a gilded cage of his parents' making, his own dreams a secret he kept locked in his heart. Their coach, Madame Elena, a stern former champion whose face seemed carved from granite, clapped her hands, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the cavernous room. "Anya, Dima, she commanded, her voice brooking no argument. "You will dance together, the Paso Doble." A murmur went through the other dancers. The Paso Doble was a dance of fire and passion, a bullfight set to music. It required a connection, a chemistry that could not be faked. Anya and Dima had never danced together before. They were the two most promising students in the academy, but their styles were so different, their energies so seemingly opposed. They took their positions, their hands meeting for the first time. Anya's small hand was swallowed in Dima's larger one. She looked up at him, her dark eyes challenging, and he looked down at her, his grey eyes calm and steady. In that first touch, a jolt of recognition passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the shared loneliness, the shared hunger that lay hidden beneath their carefully constructed exteriors. The first notes of the music, a dramatic, almost violent flourish of trumpets and guitars, sliced through the air. And then the world fell away. It was not practice. It was a duel, a challenge, a conversation held in a language older than words. Dima was the matador, his movements bold and commanding, his body a study in controlled power. Anya was the cape, a flash of scarlet and gold flowing and elusive, her every move a response to his. A taunt, a promise, that they moved as a single entity, their bodies speaking to each other with an intimacy that was shocking in its immediacy. The other dancers, one by one, stopped their own practice, their mouths slightly agape, their eyes wide with a mixture of envy and awe. Madame Elena, her arms crossed over her chest, her face a mask of professional inscrutability, felt a rare, unfamiliar stirring of emotion in her chest. The music swelled, the rhythm grew more complex, the story they were telling more intense. Dima led, Anya followed, but it was a partnership of equals, a dance of two souls recognizing each other in the heart of the music. For those few breathtaking minutes, there was no past, no future, only the electric present, the shared breath, the sweat that beaded on their foreheads, the heat that radiated from their bodies. The air crackled with a possibility that was as undeniable as it was unbeacon. When the final crashing chord of the music faded, they stood frozen, their bodies still entwined, their chests heaving, their eyes locked in a gaze that was far too profound for their tender years. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, a sacred space carved out by the magic they had just created. Then, as if waking from a dream, Dima slowly released Anya's hand. The spell was broken, but the spark, the undeniable, almost fated spark of chemistry, had been ignited. It was a fire that would burn, banked, but never extinguished, for the rest of their lives. Years passed in a montage of shared sacrifice and growing intimacy, a blur of echoing arenas, cramped overnight trains, and the endless, relentless pursuit of perfection. Their partnership became an exclusive world, a universe of two built on a foundation of trust so deep it required no words. Dima became the silent keeper of Anya's secrets, the one who knew that the fire in her eyes often masked a gnawing fear of failure. He was the one who carefully, tenderly taped her blistered toes on a rattling train to a competition in Poland, his touch a gentle comfort in the pre-dawn chill. Anya, in turn, became the guardian of his vulnerabilities, the one who saw the flicker of doubt that sometimes crossed his face before he stepped onto the dance floor. It was she who meticulously sewed a loose sequin back onto his costume moments before a final, her needle flashing in the dim light of a backstage corridor, her quiet competence a calming balm to his frayed nerves. Their lives were a tapestry woven from whispered strategy talks in the echoing hallways of arenas across Europe, of shared cheap snacks that tasted like feasts because they were eaten together, of knowing glances exchanged over the heads of judges and competitors. They learned to read each other's thoughts, to anticipate each other's moves, to communicate in a language of subtle shifts in weight, of the slightest pressure of a hand, of the shared rhythm of their breathing. Their world was the 20 by 30 metre expanse of the dance floor, and in that world they were everything to each other. The line between their art and their hearts began to blur, the disciplined intimacy of their dance seeping into the quiet moments between practices and performances, the press of his hand on her back, the slide of her leg against his, the shared breath in a tight hold. Every movement was a study in controlled passion, a slow-burn tension that was a fire banked, a love suppressed for the sake of a shared sacred dream. The fire nearly blazed into the open during a private coaching session for the Rumba, the dance of love. Their instructor, a wiry, intense man named Anton, grew frustrated with their technical perfection. "Stop counting!" he barked, his voice echoing in the empty studio. "Stop thinking, tell me the show me you cannot live without her." His words hung in the air, a challenge and a dare. Dima, goaded, looked into Anya's eyes, and for one breathtaking minute they dropped the technique, the steps, the counts, and danced only for each other. The air grew thick, their movements charged with a raw, desperate longing that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. He pulled her close, his hand splayed against the small of her back, his body moulding to hers as if they were two halves of a whole. She melted into his embrace, her head thrown back, her eyes closed, her body a pliant instrument in his hands. The story they told was not one of gentle romance, but of a fierce, all-consuming passion, a love that was both a salvation and a torment. The moment the music ended, they sprang apart, shaken and blushing, the unspoken truth hanging between them like a tangible thing. The air was thick with it, the silence deafening. They could not look at each other, could not speak. The shared dream, their pact, was the only thing that held them back from the precipice. That dream came a step closer to reality after a career-defining win at the German Open. Swept up in the glittering chaos of the awards ceremony, the flash of cameras, the roar of the crowd, the scent of victory and champagne, Dima pulled Anya into a quiet alcove behind a velvet curtain. Flushed with victory and adrenaline, he cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the sharp, delicate lines of her cheekbones. His eyes, dark and intense, searched hers, and in their depths she saw the reflection of her own longing, her own unspoken desire. The kiss they had both silently craved for years was a breath away, a heartbeat from becoming a reality. But at the last second he hesitated. The weight of their shared ambition, the years of sacrifice, the sacred pact they had made, all rushed into the space between them. He rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her skin, and whispered the words that had become their mantra, their promise, their everything. The World Championship. First. She did not protest, did not argue. She simply nodded, her eyes closing as she savoured the bitter-sweet agony of the moment. The dream was everything. It had to be. And so they turned away from the precipice, their hands clasped together, their hearts beating in unison, and walked back into the glittering light, their love a secret fire that would continue to burn, fueling their journey to the top. The world of sequins and samba rhythms was annihilated overnight. The full-scale invasion erupted just before Dima's 18th birthday, a brutal, deafening roar that shattered the fragile beauty of their lives. The grand ballroom, once a sanctuary of dreams, became a shelter, its polished floor a cold bed for displaced families, its gilded mirrors reflecting the hollow eyes of fear. The beat of the music was replaced by the percussive terror of distant shelling, a relentless, gut-wrenching rhythm that became the new soundtrack of their lives. The conflict was no longer an abstract headline in a newspaper, but a raw, visceral reality that tore at the very fabric of their existence. It became a war of survival versus ambition, of love of country versus love of each other. The catalyst for their personal apocalypse came in the form of a missile that struck the residential street where Dima's family lived. The building was damaged, the familiar landscape of his childhood transformed into a nightmare of shattered glass and twisted metal. While his immediate family was safe, their home was no longer a sanctuary. That night, Dima, his face streaked with soot and grime, pulled injured neighbours from the rubble, his hands, once so graceful and precise on the dance floor, now raw and bloodied. The experience was a brutal awakening, a violent collision with a reality he could no longer ignore. He saw his father, a man he had always viewed as invincible, a champion, looking frail and helpless amidst the chaos, his eyes reflecting a fear Dima had never seen before. The abstract concept of defending his country became the concrete, visceral need to protect his home, his family, the very ground beneath his feet. The choice was no longer a choice, it was a moral and emotional imperative. He would volunteer. When he turned 18 in a few weeks, he would join the army. When he told Anya, her world imploded. They were huddled in a corner of the ballroom, the air thick with the smell of dust and fear. The distant thud of artillery was a constant, unnerving presence. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and a dawning, terrible understanding. For her, it was a choice, a betrayal of everything they had worked for, everything they had sacrificed. "They are not forcing you," she pleaded, her voice a raw whisper. "You're choosing to leave our dream. You're choosing to leave Mo for Dima. There was no choice, no other path he could take. His tio, once so alive in the music, was now tethered to the fate of his country, his family. There is no dream if there is no home to dream in, he told her, his voice rough with a pain that mirrored her own. There is no dance floor if there is no country to dance in. His words, meant to explain, to comfort, instead carved a heartbreaking rift between them, a chasm of misunderstanding that seemed impossible to bridge. His duty to his family, his love for his country clashed with his promise to her, his love for her. Two right but incompatible choices, two hearts breaking under the weight of a world they could no longer control. The stormy, desperate agony of a future being sacrificed hung between them, a tangible, suffocating presence. Their shared soul, once so perfectly in sync on the dance floor, was now torn in two, a casualty of a war they had never asked for, a war that was destroying everything they had ever known, everything they had ever loved. The night after his 18th birthday was a shroud of silence and sorrow. It was his last night of freedom, his last night as the boy Anya had known, before the dawn would transform him into a soldier. They met in their silent, darkened dance studio, the grand ballroom a tomb of their shared past. The arguments were over, the pleas exhausted, leaving only a profound, shared grief that filled the cavernous space like a physical presence. The moonlight filtering through the tall, arched windows painted silver ghosts on the parquet floor, ghosts of 1,000 dances, 1,000 shared dreams. The repressed emotions of a decade, the unspoken love that had been the silent soundtrack of their lives, erupted not in anger, but in heartbreaking confessions whispered into the stillness of the night. "I don't know how to dance without you," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the vast emptiness of the room. Her words were not a complaint, but a simple, devastating statement of fact. He was her other half, the anchor of her art, the rhythm of her soul. He turned to her, his face a mask of anguish in the pale moonlight. "Then you will have to learn to dance for me," he replied, his voice cracking on the last word. It was not a command, but a plea, a last will and testament. He was consciously entrusting their entire shared history, their future, into her hands, making her the sole guardian of the life they were supposed to live together. "Dance for us both," he whispered, his hand finding hers in the darkness, his fingers lacing through hers, a desperate final connection. The weight of his words, the crushing sacred weight of their shared dream, settled upon her, and in that moment she understood. Her love was no longer a secret to be managed, a fire to be banked, but the defiant fuel for her survival, for his legacy. Among the ghosts of their 1,000 dances, in the hallowed space that had been their sanctuary, they made love for the first and only time. It was a desperate, profound claiming, a final, sacred act of communion. Each touch was a memory being forged against the cold certainty of loss, each kiss a promise whispered into the darkness. There was a raw spiritual depth to their intimacy, a fusion of terror, grief, and incandescent love. It was a fierce and vulnerable attempt to say what words never could, a desperate act of rebellion against the fate that was tearing them apart. His hands, once so sure and steady on the dance floor, now trembled as they explored the soft, secret curves of her body, his touch a mixture of reverence and a desperate, possessive hunger. She responded with a raw, untamed passion of her own, her body a canvas for the emotions that had been suppressed for so long. There was no artifice, no technique, only the pure, unadulterated language of two souls merging, two hearts breaking, two bodies clinging to each other in a final, desperate embrace. It was a love that was as beautiful as it was tragic, as pure as it was doomed. In making his impossible choice, Dima found a sliver of peace, a fragile, fleeting sense of solace in the knowledge that their life's work would not die even if he did, and Anya, in accepting the sacred, crushing weight of their shared dream, found a new, terrible strength, a reason to survive, a reason to dance. As a refugee in Italy, Anya was a ghost. The vibrant, passionate girl who had lived and breathed for the dance was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed wraith who moved through the world as if in a dream. The dance floor, once her sanctuary, was now a torment, each note of music a painful reminder of a life that was no more. For a year she did not dance, she could not. The music was silent within her, her body a stranger to the rhythms that had once been its lifeblood. Then the news arrived, a clinical, devastating blow delivered in a crisp official envelope. Dima was killed near Bakhmut. The words were a knife to her heart, a final, brutal severing of the thread that had connected her to her past. Grief hollowed her out, leaving a vast, aching emptiness in its wake. But in the desolate landscape of her sorrow, his last words began to echo, a faint, insistent whisper that grew into a roar. "Dance for us both." His words became her resurrection. She found a new partner, a patient, powerful Italian named Marco, a man with sad eyes who understood that he was only dancing with half of her soul. He did not try to fill the empty space beside her, did not try to replace what had been lost. He simply offered her his strength, his support, his unwavering belief in the power of her art. And so Anya returned to the world of competitive dance, her movements infused with the new depth, a tragic, breathtaking beauty that silenced audiences and brought tears to the eyes of judges. The World Championship Finals. The roar of the crowd was a distant ocean, the glittering lights of the arena a blur. As she took her final bow, the victor, she held the trophy to her chest, its cold, hard weight a tangible symbol of a promise kept, a dream realized. Later, during the victor's exhibition dance, she dismissed Marco with a gentle, grateful smile. She approached the orchestra conductor and whispered a request. The first familiar notes of their rumba, the dance of love, filled the arena, a sweet, poignant melody that was both a celebration and a lament. She danced it alone, her eyes closed, her arms cradling an invisible partner. The audience was mesmerized, held captive by the raw, heartbreaking beauty of the moment. They were witnessing something holy, a love that transcended death, a dance that was a prayer, a tribute, a final, defiant act of love. As the final note faded, tears streamed down her face, a silent, cleansing river of grief and love and triumph. And in the hushed silence of the vast arena, she whispered to the empty space beside her, the space that would always be his, "My Mogli." We made it. No more shadows. The town of Northwood Mills was a place of carefully drawn lines, as rigid and unyielding as the iron fences that separated the sprawling lawns of Sterling Hill from the gridded, modest streets below. For Eleanor Vance, these lines were the invisible architecture of her life. She navigated them with the quiet intensity of a scholarship student, a ghost in the fluorescent-lit hallways of a high school that worshipped names like Sterling. She was a creature of the library, of dog-eared paperbacks and the silent hum of the radiator in her small book-cluttered bedroom. This room was her sanctuary, a world away from the roaring social ecosystem of the football stadium, where the town's golden boy Liam Sterling reigned supreme. Liam was Northwood Mills' crown prince. As the star quarterback, his existence was a public spectacle of triumph and expectation. His family's name was etched onto the cornerstone of the town library he never entered, and the hospital wing his mother chaired. Yet, within the gilded cage of his life, there was a profound and secret ache, an intellectual insecurity that felt like a hollow space in his chest, a desperate need to be seen for something other than the strength of his throwing arm. This was their secret, that the two most disparate points in their town's social geography had found a common centre. Their relationship was a clandestine routine, a fragile bubble of existence confined to the four walls of Elle's bedroom. Twice a week after his practice and her library shift, his expensive truck would park 2 streets over, and he would slip through the shadows of her backyard, a silhouette against the dusk, climbing the familiar trellis to her second-story window. Inside, the world fell away. There was no Sterling Hill, no scholarship grants, only the scent of old paper and vanilla candles. Here, he wasn't the quarterback, and she wasn't the invisible girl. He was just Liam, his brow furrowed in concentration as she explained the thematic complexities of The Great Gatsby. She was just Elle, her voice soft but sure as she untangled the knots of his calculus homework. They were two halves of a whole person, her mind, his gilded cage, finding solace in the quiet space between. The spark that threatened to ignite their secret world into ash came on a crisp October night. The Northwood Panthers had just clinched the regional title in a blaze of glory. The town was electric, a current of victory running through its streets. Elle had listened to the game on her small radio, her heart thumping in time with the announcer's frantic play-by-play. A victory for him, feeling strangely like a victory for her, for them. He arrived later than usual, his face flushed with triumph and cheap champagne pilfered from a teammate's flask. He smelled of sweat and autumn air, and when he pulled her into his arms, she could feel the frantic, joyful energy thrumming through him. He was still wearing his Letterman jacket, the heavy wool a foreign texture in the soft sanctuary of her room. "We did it, Elle," he breathed into her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "God, you should have been there." She smiled against his chest, a familiar pang of longing mixing with her pride. "I was, in spirit." They were lying on her braided rug, surrounded by towers of books, his head in her lap. She was tracing the line of his jaw when the sound came, the blare of a car horn, followed by a chorus of triumphant, drunken shouts. "Sterling, you legend!" Liam froze. Every muscle in his body went rigid. Elle's hand stilled on his face. It was his world, the loud, boisterous, unthinking world of his friends, invading hers. A dark blue sedan, packed with his teammates, crawled past her house, their faces illuminated in the intermittent glow of the streetlights. They honked again, a long, celebratory blast that seemed to shake the very foundations of her small home. "Think they saw my truck," he whispered, his voice tight. "No, you parked on Elm," she whispered back, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. "They're just celebrating." They lay in silence, two statues in the candlelight, as the car receded down the street, its noise fading into the general hum of the town's victory party. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was heavier than the noise had been. It was thick with everything they never said, every line they were afraid to cross. He was the sun, and she was a creature of the shadows he cast. Their orbits could only intersect in this stolen darkness. He pushed himself up on his elbows, his eyes, the colour of a stormy sea, searching hers. The bravado from the game was gone, replaced by something raw and vulnerable. He saw her, truly saw her, not as the girl who fixed his essays, but as the architect of this sacred quiet, the keeper of the only part of himself he considered real. Without a word, he closed the small distance between them and pulled her against him. The gesture was not one of triumph, but of desperation. It was a fierce, protective claiming, a silent plea for the world outside her window to simply disappear. In the flickering candlelight of the room they never spoke in, he held on to her as if she were the only thing preventing him from being swept away by the tide of his own life. The secret they shared was a constant low-humming fear, but in that moment, It was also the most exquisite ache, a pocket of impossible warmth against a cold and judgmental world. The city was a sprawling, anonymous beast, and for Eleanor, it was the landscape of liberation. The university campus, with its Gothic spires and sprawling libraries, was a world built to the scale of her ambitions. For the first time, she was not defined by the confines of Northwood Mills or the quiet intensity that had made her invisible there. Here, her mind was currency. She flourished, her essays earning accolades from discerning professors, her insights in seminars drawing nods of respect from her peers. She found a tribe of fellow intellects, late-night debates over coffee and poetry readings becoming the new, vibrant texture of her life. For Liam, admitted on a prestigious athletic scholarship, the same campus was an alienating labyrinth. The small-town crown he had worn so easily was worthless here. He was just another face in a sea of thousands, his fame confined to the clipped, strategic conversations of the football department. The weight of expectation was different now, heavier and colder, untempered by the familiar adoration of his hometown. Then, during a grueling pre-season practice, the trajectory of his life snapped. A misstep, a brutal tackle, and a searing pain in his knee that echoed the sound of his future breaking. The injury was career-threatening. The identity that had been so carefully constructed for him since he was a boy was stripped away, leaving him adrift in the vast, indifferent ocean of the university. Their secret meetings migrated from the warmth of her book-filled bedroom to the sterile chill of his dorm room. The space was impersonal, smelling of antiseptic and protein powder, a reflection of his own profound displacement. The cinder block walls were bare, save for a calendar of training schedules that now served as a mocking testament to a life that was no longer his. In this stark new setting, the power dynamic that had always hummed beneath their secret began to invert. Stripped of his physical prowess, Liam became deeply, terrifyingly vulnerable. The intellectual insecurity he had hidden in Northwood Mills was now a gaping wound. He was failing the complex language of his sociology and philosophy textbooks, a foreign tongue he couldn't decipher. "I don't get it, Elle," he'd confess, his voice thick with a shame she had never heard from him before, running a hand through his hair as he stared at a dense page of Foucault. "It's like they're all speaking a different language. Without football, I'm a disappointment. I'm nothing." She, in turn, became his anchor. The role was not entirely new, but its dimensions had shifted. It was no longer about helping him pass a test. It was about holding him together. She would sit on the edge of his neatly made bed, her voice a steady, calming presence as she read his textbooks aloud. Translating complex theories into stories he could understand, she helped him structure his essays, drawing out his own halting thoughts and polishing them until they shone with a clarity he couldn't have managed alone. She shared the thrill of her own academic discoveries, her passion, a small flame in the cold room, and he would watch her, his gaze filled with a mixture of awe and a quiet, desperate fear. She was no longer just his secret, the quiet girl he met in the dark. She was his lifeline. One evening, Elle was invited to read an original short story at a popular campus literary night held in a perpetually crowded coffee house called the Scriptorium. She didn't tell Liam. It was an instinctive act of self-preservation, an assumption that this part of her world, this public validation of her mind, would be as foreign and uninteresting to him as his locker room was to her. It was her victory, separate from the fragile ecosystem of their secret. But he found out. A flyer, tacked to a corkboard in the student union, caught his eye. An evening of original prose featuring Eleanor Vance. Her name, printed in stark black ink, seemed to jump out at him. That night, he put on a plain grey hoodie, pulled the hood over his head, and navigated the unfamiliar territory of the arts quad. He found the scriptorium overflowing, the air thick with the smell of roasted coffee and intellectual fervour. He stood in the shadows at the very back, his broad shoulders and athletic frame making him conspicuous even as he tried to disappear. Then she took the stage, She was wearing a simple black dress, her hair pulled back, her face illuminated by the single spotlight. She looked terrified for a moment, her eyes scanning the crowd. But when she began to read, her voice, the same voice that untangled academic theory for him in the quiet of his room, filled the space with a confidence that stunned him. Her story was a beautiful, aching thing about small towns and the secrets they keep. It was witty and profound, and the audience was captivated. Liam watched her, mesmerised. This was a version of Elle he had never seen. She wasn't his quiet tutor, his hidden solace. She was a force, a creator of worlds, admired by a room full of people who saw the brilliance he had only ever witnessed in private. The longing in his gaze was no longer just for her touch or her presence. It was a profound, humbling awe. He felt a fierce, possessive pride that was immediately followed by a wave of crushing inadequacy. Later, when he slipped into her dorm room, she was buzzing with adrenaline, her cheeks flushed. "You are incredible," he said, his voice quiet. He hadn't taken off the hoodie, as if still trying to hide. She turned, startled. "You were there?" "I saw the flyer." He stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. The air between them crackled with a new, complex electricity. His physical need for her, once the dominant current in their interactions, was now tangled with a desperate emotional dependency. Her newfound confidence was a beacon, but it also illuminated the chasm that was opening between their worlds. He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. His touch, which had always been a source of comfort, now felt charged with his own fragility. "I have never," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't quite name, "been proud of anyone like I was tonight." When he kissed her, it was different from all the kisses that had come before. It was not a kiss of equals meeting in the dark. It was a kiss of pure, humbled adoration. It was the kiss of a man worshipping at the altar of a brilliance he feared he could never match. A desperate, breathless acknowledgement that she was already outgrowing the small, secret room he had built for them in his heart. The slow erosion of Liam's confidence and the steady rise of Elle's culminated in a single, catastrophic moment. Liam's father, a man forged in the crucible of old money and unshakable self-importance, was a powerful university alumnus. He arrived on campus for a donor weekend, a whirlwind of tailored suits and booming pronouncements, his presence a heavy weight on Liam's already burdened shoulders. He insisted on taking Liam and a few of his old high school friends, acolytes who still saw Liam as the Northwood Panthers' immortal quarterback, to dinner at the Chantry, a restaurant whose hushed elegance and exorbitant prices were designed to make people like Elle feel they had wandered in by mistake. But by a cruel twist of fate, Elle was there. She was seated at a boisterous table with her new university friends, celebrating a prestigious scholarship grant she had just won. Her laughter, bright and uninhibited, carried across the clink of silverware and muted conversations. She looked radiant, alive, a world away from the girl who once hid in the shadows with him. Liam saw her the moment he walked in. His heart seized, a cold dread washing over him. Their worlds, so carefully segregated, were about to collide. For a moment, their eyes met across the room. A flash of surprise and joy lit her face before it was replaced by a cautious uncertainty as she took in his companions, his imposing father, the smirking faces from their past. Liam's father followed his gaze. "Friend of yours, son?" he asked, his tone laced with dismissive curiosity. "Just someone from a class," Liam mumbled, his throat tight. As they were being led to their table, they passed close to Elle's. One of Liam's friends, a boy named Mark, who had always treated Elle with a particular brand of sneering invisibility in high school, recognized her. "Hey, isn't that Vance?" Mark said loudly. "She's still cleaning blackboards to stay here?" Mr. Sterling let out a short, dry laugh. He glanced at Elle's table, at their animated, intelligent faces, and then said, with the casual cruelty of the truly privileged, You have to admire the tenacity of the scholarship kids. They work so hard to get a glimpse of a world they'll never really belong to. The words struck Elle like a physical blow. The laughter and warmth of her celebration evaporated, leaving a chilling silence in its wake. But it was not his father's comment that broke her. It was Liam. She looked at him, her eyes pleading, searching for a flicker of defence, a word, anything. He stood frozen, trapped in the crossfire of his two lives. His face was a mask of panic and shame. He met her gaze, and in his eyes she saw not love or loyalty, but a deep, primal fear. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a silent, desperate plea for her to understand, to simply let it go, to disappear as she had always been so good at doing. That tiny movement was a betrayal more profound than any shouted insult. It was the confirmation of her deepest, most fiercely guarded fear, that in the real world, the world of light and consequence, she was not his anchor, but his liability, a secret he was ashamed to keep. Elle's carefully constructed composure fractured. She stood up so abruptly her chair scraped loudly against the polished floor. Without a word to her friends, she grabbed her coat and walked out of the restaurant, her head held high, her back a rigid line of wounded pride. She didn't look back. The aftermath was a brutal silence. She didn't answer his calls. His frantic texts, a cascade of apologies and excuses, went unread. For 2 days he was a ghost haunting the edges of her life, until he finally cornered her on the stone steps outside the library, the very heart of her new kingdom. The confrontation was quiet, which made it all the more devastating. The autumn air was crisp, students hurrying past them, oblivious to the world that was collapsing between them. "Elle, please," he began, his voice raw. "You don't understand, my father." "I understand perfectly," she said, her own voice terrifyingly calm, stripped of all its former warmth. It was the voice of a stranger. "There is no room for me in your world, Liam. There never was. We just pretended there was, in the dark where no one could see." "That's not true," he insisted, his desperation making him clumsy. "I was scared. I'm a coward. I know." "You are," she agreed, the simple affirmation more cutting than any accusation. "But it's more than that. You are ashamed, and I will not be anyone's shameful secret." He tried to explain the suffocating weight of his father's expectations, his own weakness, the terror of that moment, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Pathetic excuses for a failure of character so fundamental it felt like a moral abyss. He had been weighed and measured in the one moment that mattered, and he had been found wanting. She listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When he was finished, a terrible, empty sense stretched between them. "Goodbye, Liam," she said softly. She turned and walked up the library steps, disappearing behind the heavy oak doors, leaving him shattered on the cold stone. In the weeks that followed, they became what they had always pretended not to be, true strangers. They would pass each other on campus, a chasm of unspoken truths and remembered intimacies between them, their gazes sliding past one another as if they had never touched, never shared a secret world. Elle poured her pain into her work, her brilliance sharpened by a new, brittle shell of self-protection. She excelled, winning awards, earning the respect of her professors, building a life that had no space for a cowardly ghost. Liam, without her, was utterly lost. His grades plummeted, his injured knee refused to heal. The university, seeing a failing student and a non-performing athlete, revoked his scholarship. Utterly alone, stripped of his purpose and the only person who had ever seen the man he wanted to be, he quietly dropped out and disappeared, retreating from the world that had so thoroughly defeated him. A year can be a lifetime. For Eleanor, it was a period of deliberate, painstaking reconstruction. She had built new walls around the space Liam had once occupied, reinforcing them with graduate seminars, late-night study sessions, and the quiet satisfaction of her work as a teaching assistant. Her life had a rhythm, a purpose. The ache of his memory had subsided into a dull phantom limb of a pain, a thing she could acknowledge without letting it cripple her. Then, one raw November evening, that phantom limb began to throb with a terrifying immediate agony. A torrential downpour was lashing against her small off-campus apartment window, the wind howling a mournful chorus. It was a night for staying in, for wrapping oneself in blankets and the comforting drone of old movies. A sharp, hesitant knock on her door was a dissonance she wasn't prepared for. She opened it to find him standing on her doorstep. It was Liam, but a version of him she barely recognised. The rain had plastered his hair to his forehead, and he was soaked to the bone, his thin jacket offering little protection. He was thinner, the easy athletic confidence that had once been his armour, completely gone, stripped away to reveal the raw, uncertain man beneath. His eyes, those stormy seas of blue, were haunted. "Elle," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper, the name a ghost on his lips. Her carefully constructed defences crumbled. Every instinct told her to slam the door, to protect the fragile peace she had fought so hard to win. But the sight of him, so broken, so utterly defeated, held her paralysed. She stepped back, a silent invitation, and he stumbled inside, dripping rainwater onto her worn wooden floor. Didn't make excuses. He didn't offer the pathetic apologies of the boy he had been. He stood there shivering and simply began to talk, the words pouring out of him in a torrent to match the storm outside. He told her he'd gone home, but the hollowness of his old life had been unbearable. He'd moved away, gotten a small apartment, started working a grueling construction job, his hands, once famous for their precision with a football, now calloused and rough from manual labour. He was taking night classes at a community college, studying to be an architectural draftsman, a quiet, precise art that had nothing to do with fame or glory. He told her he had been in therapy. "Losing you," he said, his voice finally breaking, tears mixing with the rain on his face. It wasn't just losing a person, it was rock bottom. It was seeing myself for what I was, a coward, a child playing a part someone else wrote for him. My father's the town's hero, but never, not once, my own man. He looked at her, his gaze raw with a year of self-recrimination and hard-won honesty. "I had to build someone worthy of you, Elle, not to win you back, but because you deserve to be loved by a man, not a shadow. I had to do it for me." He choked on a sob, his whole body shaking. "I didn't know how to exist in the light with you, because I was nothing but a shadow." The raw, brutal truth of his confession was a force of nature. It swept through her apartment, tearing down the walls she had so carefully erected. The love she had buried under layers of hurt and pride erupted, a fierce, undeniable current. This was the reckoning, the realization that their love hadn't failed because it was weak, but because he had been, and he had gone into the wilderness and remade himself, not for his father, not for glory, but for the quiet dignity of his own soul. She crossed the space between them in 2 steps, and her arms were around his neck, pulling his face down to hers. His first kiss was a desperate searching thing, tasting of rain and salt and a year of regret. Her hands were in his wet hair, on his face as if trying to memorize the new lines of this man who had fought his way back to her. He stayed the night. The storm outside raged, a fitting soundtrack to the tempest of their reunion. Their physical coming together was not the hurried, secret fumbling of their youth. It was a slow, transcendent act of rediscovery, a sacred, reverent exploration of the people they had become in the long, painful space between. He undressed her slowly, his calloused fingers tracing the lines of her body as if she were a precious, forgotten text he was finally learning to read. There was a worship in his touch, a humility that spoke of the profound change within him. He explored her with his hands, his mouth, with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. This was not the frantic need of a boy, but the deep, abiding communion of a man who understood the gift he had been given, lost and miraculously found again. When she touched him, she felt the changes in his body, the lean, hard muscle of a labourer, the faint scars on his hands. She was mapping the journey he had taken without her. Their lovemaking was a language beyond words, an act of ultimate vulnerability and forgiveness. It was the raw, desperate passion of their loss blended with the new, mature tenderness. It was breath and heat and the slick slide of skin on skin. It was the silent telling of secrets, the confession of loneliness, the promise of a new beginning. In the dark, with the rain drumming a soft tattoo against the glass, they moved together, a rhythm of return and renewal. It was a stripping away of all pretense, a surrender not of one to the other, but of both to the overwhelming truth of their connection. As their bodies found their climax, it felt less like a release and more like a merging, a spiritual and physical consummation that sealed the past and consecrated the future. Lying in the aftermath, their limbs tangled, his heart beating a steady, reassuring rhythm against her back, Elle knew that the secret room they had once hidden in was gone forever. They had finally stepped into the light. The morning after the storm broke clear and bright, the world washed clean. For Liam and Eleanor it was the dawn of a new, more deliberate chapter. They began again, not with the frantic, stolen moments of their past, but with the slow, tentative steps of two people learning to walk in the daylight. There were no more secrets, no more hidden rooms. Their love, once a fragile flame nurtured in darkness, was now brought out into the open air, and to their mutual relief it did not extinguish. It burned brighter. The first test came weeks later. Liam, his jaw set with a quiet determination that was more formidable than his old bravado, drove them to Stirling Hill. He walked into his parents' cavernous, art-filled home holding Eleanor's hand, his grip firm and unwavering. He introduced her not as a conquest, a secret, or an apology, but with a simple, unshakable dignity. "Mum, Dad," he said, his voice clear and steady. "This is Eleanor Vance, the woman I love." His father's initial reaction was a mask of cool disapproval, his mother's a flutter of nervous social calculus. There were questions, veiled in politeness, about her family, her studies, her plans. But Liam stood by her, a quiet bulwark, answering for himself, defining his own terms. He spoke of his new path, his passion for architectural design, his respect for the man he was becoming. For the first time he was not seeking their approval, merely stating his reality. And in his strength Elle found her own. She met their scrutiny not with defiance, but with the calm confidence of a woman who knew her own worth. A worth that had nothing to do with her background, and everything to do with the contents of her mind and heart. They left that house not as victors in a battle, but as two sovereign souls who had declared their independence together. Liam re-enrolled in a local university, one without a prestigious football programme, pursuing a degree in a subject he had chosen for himself. His world became one of drafting tables, blueprints, and the satisfying logic of structure and design. He found a quiet joy in it, a sense of purpose that came from creation rather than competition. Elle, continuing her graduate work, became his partner in this new life. Their evenings were no longer about her tutoring him, but about them learning from each other, a true meeting of minds. Their life together found its rhythm in the small, mundane moments of shared existence. Cooking dinner together in her small apartment, their hips bumping in the narrow kitchen. Long walks through the city, their hands intertwined. Quiet evenings spent reading side by side. The comfortable silence a testament to their deep connection. They were building a home, not of brick and mortar, but of shared trust and public affection. The story closes on a warm, hazy afternoon the following spring, months after his return. They are in a public park, a sprawling green space in the heart of the city, lying on a faded quilt spread out under the dappled shade of a large oak tree. The air is sweet with the scent of cut grass and blooming magnolias. Around them the world hums with ordinary life, children laughing, a dog chasing a frisbee, couples strolling hand in hand. Liam is lying on his stomach, propped on his elbows, deeply engrossed in a worn copy of Persuasion, one of her favourites, which he is reading for the first time. Elle is beside him, pen in hand, making thoughtful notes in the margins of one of his textbooks on urban planning. It is mundane. It is public. It is everything they never could have been before. He closes the book, a thoughtful expression on his face, and rolls onto his side to face her. He watches her for a long moment, a soft, wondering smile playing on his lips. She feels his gaze and looks up from her work, her eyes questioning. "What is it?" she asks, her voice soft. "Nothing," he says. "Everything." He leans over, his shadow falling across her page, and kisses her. It is a soft, tender kiss, unhurried and full of unspoken gratitude. It holds the memory of the storm and the promise of the calm. It's a kiss that expects nothing and contains everything. When he pulls back, his lips are still brushing against hers. He looks directly into her eyes, seeing not the scholarship girl, not his secret tutor, not his saviour, but the whole and complete woman he has finally learned how to love. With a reverence that makes her heart ache, he whispers, "Hello, Eleanor Vance." It is the first time he has ever called her by her full name. It is not a question, but an arrival, an acknowledgement that he sees all of her, every brilliant, resilient, beautiful part in the bright, unforgiving light of day, and he loves her completely. She smiles, a true and radiant bloom, and knows with every fibre of her being that they are finally home. The Forbidden Swing. The summer of 1869 held the Robinson estate in a verdant, opulent thrall. The air, thick with the mingling scents of 1,000 roses and the sweet, clean perfume of freshly mown grass, was a physical presence, a warm blanket under which society languidly perspired. It was a day for performance. The sharp crack of croquet mallets against wooden balls punctuated the polite murmur of conversations that flowed like shallow, sun-warmed streams, never daring to seek depth. Sunlight, dappled and diffused by the ancient oaks, scattered shifting patterns of gold upon the lawns, creating a scene of such curated perfection it felt almost unreal, a painter's dream of pastoral elegance. Yet, in a forgotten corner of the sprawling gardens, chaos gently reigned. An old, weathered swing, suspended from the thick bough of a gnarled oak, hung as a relic of a wilder time. Ivy, untamed and tenacious, crept up its ropes, and the ground beneath was a tapestry of moss and unruly wildflowers, a pocket of wilderness amidst the clipped precision of the estate. It was a place of secrets, a gilded cage with one corner left artfully rusted and overgrown. It was to this corner that Charles retreated. He moved through the garden party like a ghost, his thoughtful, poetic soul suffocating under the weight of expectation. His family, with their unyielding ambition, had decreed his future, a respectable, passionless career in law. The word itself, law, felt like a stone in his throat, a dull, heavy thing that would crush the life from his verses. He was a creature of shade and quiet contemplation, and the brilliant, brittle society gathered on the lawn felt like a violation. Each polite inquiry, each vapid pleasantry was a barb against his vulnerable spirit, a spirit that yearned not for wealth or status, but for a life of meaning, a life where the soul could breathe. He found the swing as if guided by an invisible thread of shared melancholy. It hung motionless, a silent testament to forgotten joys. He traced the grain of the weathered wood with a fingertip, a quiet communion with something that, like him, seemed out of place. He was not alone for long. Agnes Robinson, the middle daughter, found her way to the same secluded spot. Known for a wit as sharp as her intellect, she navigated the drawing rooms and garden parties with a composed grace that concealed a fiercely rebellious heart. She was a woman of profound thought in a world that valued only pretty phrases. The expectation that she would marry for status, a union of properties rather than souls, was a constant, simmering wound. Lord Ashworth, her father's choice, was a man whose title was his only interesting quality, and the thought of being tethered to his pompous vacuity felt like a sentence to a lifetime of intellectual starvation. She feared, with a terror that was almost physical, that her mind, her very spirit, would be locked away in the gilded cage of a conventional marriage. She saw Charles standing by the swing and paused, not wanting to intrude on his solitude, yet drawn to the quiet understanding she sensed in his posture. He looked up, his eyes, deep contemplative pools, meeting hers. "Forgive me," she said, her voice a low counterpoint to the distant laughter. "I seem to have stumbled upon your refuge." "It is a refuge for anyone who seeks it, I imagine," Charles replied, his voice softer than she had expected. "I was just admiring this swing. It feels as though it belongs to another time." Agnes moved closer, her sharp gaze taking in the scene, the swing, the man, the palpable sense of shared escape. "A freer, less complicated time," she murmured, almost to herself. Then, with a flicker of the wit that was her armour, she added, "For we were all required to give such convincing performances." The word performance hung in the air between them, a perfect gleaming pearl of understanding. It was a truth so profound, so deeply felt by them both, that it transcended the need for further explanation. In that single word, a current was established, an instantaneous recognition of kindred spirits trapped in the same elaborate play. Charles felt a loosening in his chest, a breath he did not know he had been holding. He had spent his life surrounded by people who spoke of weather and weddings, of politics and profits, yet here was a woman who spoke of the very essence of his own confinement. "I have often felt like an actor on a stage," he confessed, the words coming more easily than he could have imagined. "Speaking lines I have not written, playing a part I did not choose." "And the audience is so easily pleased," Agnes responded, a faint wry smile touching her lips. "As long as one bows at the right moments and never misses a cue, they applaud with great enthusiasm." Their eyes met again, and in that shared glance, a silent pact was made. The noise of the garden party faded into a distant hum, the world beyond their small ivy-draped sanctuary ceasing to exist. The air around the swing, already thick with the scent of roses and wild things, became charged with a new, unspoken longing. It was the thrill of discovery, the sudden, sharp joy of finding an echo of one's own soul in another. But it was a joy tinged with the melancholy of their shared reality, the knowledge that this moment of connection was a stolen one, a brief interlude in a play that would soon demand their return to the stage. For now, however, they stood in the quiet wilderness of the forgotten corner, two prisoners who had, for a fleeting moment, found the key to each other's cage. Their first meeting at the swing was not an end, but a beginning. It became their secret cathedral, a place of quiet worship in the twilight hours, after the day's performances were done. By unspoken agreement they would slip away from the drawing rooms, from the endless card games and stilted conversations, and find their way to the old oak. The world of propriety and expectation fell away the moment they entered the wild garden, leaving only the truth of their own hearts. Charles, who had never dared to share his verses with another soul, now found himself reading them aloud to Agnes. He would bring with him scandalous new books of poetry, works that defied the rigid sensibilities of their time, and in the deepening gloom, his voice would give life to words of passion and rebellion. Agnes, in turn, unlocked the secrets of her own mind. She brought her private journal, a small leather-bound book filled with astute, often cynical observations of their world. Her words were a mirror to his own thoughts, a sharp, clear reflection of the absurdities and injustices they both saw but were powerless to change. They talked for hours, their conversations stripping away the layers of polite society. He spoke of his dreams of leaving England, of finding a place where a man could be a poet without being a pariah. She confessed her terror of the impending betrothal to Lord Ashworth, a man who would value her dowry more than her mind. In the sanctuary of their shared secrets, they were not the dutiful son and the marriageable daughter, but simply Charles and Agnes, two souls yearning for freedom. One evening, a soft summer rain began to fall, whispering through the leaves of the great oak. They took shelter in a small abandoned gardener's folly nearby, a stone structure half swallowed by ivy. Huddled together in the dim, earthy-smelling space, the world outside blurred into a watercolour of grey and green. The scent of damp earth and rain-soaked stone filled the air, an intimate perfume that seemed to draw them closer. Agnes, her voice barely a whisper, confessed the true depth of her fear. "It is not simply that I do not love him," she said, her eyes fixed on the rain-streaked window. "It is that he will extinguish whatever light I have within me. I will become another of his possessions, a pretty ornament for his drawing-room, my thoughts and opinions locked away like last season's gowns." In that moment of unguarded vulnerability, Charles felt a surge of protective tenderness. He saw not the witty, composed Miss Robinson, but a frightened girl, her spirit as fragile as a bird's wing. He in turn confessed his own deepest fear. "And I," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show, "I will become a man I do not recognize, a creature of contracts and courtrooms, my verses buried under a mountain of legal briefs. To leave England, it is not merely a dream, it is a necessity. It is the only way I can save myself." The rain subsided, leaving the world washed clean and glistening. A few nights later, under a sky strewn with stars, Agnes sat on the swing, the wood still cool and damp from the earlier shower. Charles stood behind her, his hands on the ropes. He gave a gentle push, and she soared into the night air, a silent, graceful arc against the darkness. His hands brushed her back with each push, a touch so light, so fleeting, it was almost imaginary, yet it sent a shiver through her. The rhythm was hypnotic, a slow, intimate dance in the moonlight. The only sounds were the soft creak of the ropes and the whisper of her skirts through the still air. As the swing slowed, he brought it to a halt, his hands resting on her shoulders, his face close to hers. The world fell away, leaving only the two of them in the moon-dappled shadows. The scent of her hair, a faint perfume of lavender and rain, filled his senses. He leaned in, his heart a wild, frantic bird in his chest, and gave her a soft, hesitant first kiss. It was a taste of freedom, a promise of a world beyond their gilded cages. It was not a kiss of passion, but of recognition, a tender affirmation of the unspoken truth that had grown between them in their secret meetings. When he drew back, the world rushed in with a startling clarity. For Agnes, it was as if she had been holding her breath her entire life and had only just exhaled. A profound stillness settled over her, a silence in which every sensation was magnified. She felt the slight tremble in his hands on her shoulders, the warmth of his breath against her cheek, the cool night air on her lips where his had been. this feeling. It was not the giddy foolishness she read about in novels. It was a deep, resonant chord of rightness, a sense of having arrived at a place she had not known she was seeking. The cynical armour she wore so expertly melted away, leaving her utterly, terrifyingly vulnerable. And in that vulnerability, a fragile bud of hope began to unfurl. Charles watched her, his own heart a tempest of fear and exultation. In the space of that single brief kiss, his abstract yearnings had found a tangible form. She was the poetry he had been trying to write, the meaning he had been searching for. He had feared he had overstepped, that he had shattered the delicate trust they had built. But as he looked into her wide, luminous eyes, he saw not reproach, but a reflection of his own dawning wonder. The future his father had mapped out for him, the life of law and loveless duty, seemed not just unpalatable, but impossible. He could not, would not walk that path now that he knew a single kiss could hold more truth than 1,000 legal texts. Neither spoke. The silence was not empty, but filled with the weight of their shared revelation. The air around the swing, once thick with unspoken longing, now hummed with a new, more potent energy. The creak of the ropes, the scent of her hair, the warmth of his hand on the small of her back as he finally helped her from the swing. Every small detail was now imbued with a sacred significance. Their inner conflict was no longer a battle between desire and fear, but a war between a world of impossible love and a world of unbearable loss. The idyllic twilight of their secret meetings was destined to be shattered by the harsh dawn of reality. The external pressures, which had always loomed like distant storm clouds, now moved in with a terrifying, inexorable speed. Agnes's parents, with the casual cruelty of the truly powerful, formally announced their intention to betroth her to Lord Ashworth. The union was praised in the drawing rooms of Hollingford as a perfect match, a brilliant alliance of status and wealth. The words, meant to be a chorus of celebration, sounded to Agnes like the tolling of a funeral bell. Simultaneously, Charles's gilded cage began to shrink. His father, a man whose will was as unbending as iron, presented him with a non-negotiable legal apprenticeship in London to begin at once. The dream of escape, of a life of art and meaning, was to be sacrificed on the altar of familial duty. Their separate prisons were about to snap shut. The locks turned, the keys thrown away. A seed of doubt planted by the cold reality of her situation began to grow in Agnes's heart. She saw the ruin that a rebellion would bring, not only upon herself, but upon Charles. A penniless poet and a disowned daughter. What future could they possibly have in a world that valued only position and property? Her love for him, which had been a source of strength, now became a source of fear. She could not bear the thought of being the architect of his destruction. Charles, meanwhile, was wrestling with his own demons. He saw Agnes in conversation with Lord Ashworth at a formal dinner, her face a mask of polite composure. He saw her smile, a faint, distant curve of her lips, and his heart twisted with a bitter, jealous pain. He did not see the terror in her eyes, the desperate plea for a rescue she knew he could not provide. He saw only a woman accepting her fate, a woman choosing the cold security of status over the uncertain passion of their forbidden love. Their final meeting at the swing was a study in misunderstanding. Agnes, feeling trapped and desperate, tried to explain her impossible position. She spoke of duty, of family, of the ruin that would befall them both. But her words, meant to convey the depth of her love and her fear, came out sounding pragmatic and resigned. "It is what is expected," she said, her voice devoid of its usual life. "There is no other way." Charles, his own heart raw with disappointment, heard not her fear, but her surrender. He did not confront her with the passionate despair that was consuming him, but with a cold, bitter disappointment that was far more cruel. "I see," he said, his voice a shard of ice. "You are just like everyone else, after all. I should have known." He did not wait for her reply, but turned and walked away, leaving her alone with the silent, motionless swing and the crushing weight of his misunderstanding. Heartbroken, believing that Charles had given up on them, that he saw her as a creature of convention rather than a woman in love, Agnes retreated into a cold, protective shell of propriety. She attended the endless rounds of social engagements, her face a perfect, unreadable mask. She accepted the congratulations on her betrothal with a grace that was as chilling as it was flawless. Inside, however, her heart was a barren, frozen landscape. Charles, feeling betrayed and utterly alone, prepared for his departure to London. He packed his books of poetry at the bottom of his trunk, burying them under a mountain of legal texts. He resigned himself to the dull, passionless future he had so desperately sought to avoid. The vibrant, sun-drenched gardens of the Robinson estate now felt like a prison, the scent of roses a cloying reminder of a love that was lost. The air, once charged with unspoken desire, was now heavy with an aching silence, the suffocating weight of words left unsaid. The swing, their secret sanctuary, hung motionless and empty, a forgotten relic in a forgotten corner of the garden, a silent testament to a dream that had died. The eve of her engagement announcement was a symphony of polite suffocation. The drawing room at the Robinson estate glittered with candlelight, the air thick with the scent of lilies and the murmur of self-congratulatory chatter. Agnes moved through the crowd like a phantom, her smile a brittle painted thing. Each compliment, each well-wishing remark, was a nail in the coffin of her happiness. She could not breathe. The walls, hung with silk and gilded mirrors, seemed to be closing in on her. With a sudden desperate clarity, she knew she could not bear another moment. Excusing herself with a murmured plea of a headache, she fled. She did not stop until she reached the wild, unkempt corner of the garden, the one place where she had ever felt free. The swing, her silent confidant, awaited her. She sank onto the weathered wood, the familiar creak of the ropes a mournful echo of her own broken heart. The tears she had held back for so long came at last, silent, scalding tracks in the moonlight. Charles had told himself he would leave without seeing her again. He had packed his trunks, arranged his travel, steeled his heart against the memory of her. But he could not go. He could not leave without one last lingering look at the place where his heart had, for a brief, brilliant moment, found its home. He was drawn to the swing by a force he could not name, a desperate, irrational hope he could not extinguish. He found her there, a small, solitary figure in the moonlight, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. In that instant, all pretense shattered. The carefully constructed walls of pride and bitterness crumbled, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth of their love. "Agnes," he said, his voice hoarse with an emotion he could no longer suppress. She looked up, her face pale and tear-streaked, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and a desperate, fragile hope. He did not need to speak his heart. It was there in his eyes, in the raw anguish of his expression. He crossed the small space between them in 2 strides and fell to his knees before her, taking her cold hands in his. "I would rather live in poverty with you than in a palace without you," he whispered, the words a torrent of repressed longing and despair. "I was a fool, a blind, arrogant fool." "I thought you had given up on me," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "I thought you believed I had chosen that." "I believed what my own broken heart told me to believe," he confessed, "and I have been living in a hell of my own making ever since. A life without you is no life at all," she whispered, her fingers tightening on his. "It is a slow, cold death." Their words, filled with months of unspoken pain, erupted into a passionate, desperate embrace. Pride and fear were burned away by the white-hot flame of their love. This was their turning point, their reckoning. To seize this one fragile chance at happiness, or to lose each other forever. He rose, pulling her to her feet. He led her away from the swing, deeper into the wild heart of the garden, to the old folly where they had once sheltered from the rain. The air was cool and damp, redolent with the scent of wet earth and overgrown ivy. Inside, the small stone structure was a haven of shadows, a secret world away from the prying eyes of the glittering house. There, on a bed of old burlap sacks that smelled of earth and time, he drew her down. The kiss that had begun in desperation by the swing now deepened into something else entirely, a slow, deliberate exploration, a silent language of reverence and need. Moonlight filtered through a high, grimy window painted them in strokes of silver and shadow. Every sound was magnified, the sigh of her breath, the frantic beat of his heart, the whisper of fabric against the rough floor. This was not a polite union. It was a sacred rebellion. A ribbon undone, a collar unfastened. Each was a barrier falling, a layer of the world they were leaving behind being stripped away. His hands, which had only known the pages of books, now learned the living poetry of her form, the curve of her waist, the delicate hollow of her neck, the silk of her skin beneath his trembling fingers. He worshipped her with his touch, a desperate and tender catechism. For Agnes, this was a profound surrender not to him, but to herself. The sharp-witted, guarded woman gave way to a creature of pure sensation. The heat of his skin against hers was a revelation, a warmth that thawed the ice that had encased her heart. She met his urgency with her own, her touch a fierce answer to his silent questions. It was a strange and holy communion, a mixture of raw sensuality and profound emotional catharsis. His mouth, which had spoken such bitter words, now whispered her name against her skin like a prayer. Her tears, once born of sorrow, were now tears of a joy so intense it was almost painful, a release of a lifetime of pent-up longing. The world outside, with its gilded cages and stifling expectations, ceased to exist. There was only this moment, this sanctuary. Their bodies, finally free, moved in a rhythm as old as the moon and tides, a dance of discovery and homecoming. It was a shattering of loneliness, a fusion of two souls who'd been wandering in the dark and had at last found their light in each other. In the quiet aftermath, they lay entangled in the shadows, their bodies still humming with the echo of their passion. His arm was a warm, heavy anchor across her waist. Her head rested in the hollow of his shoulder, her breath soft against his skin. They were no longer a boy and a girl dreaming of freedom. They were a man and a woman who had seized it. The world had not changed, the obstacles had not vanished, but they had. Their shared vulnerability had become their greatest strength. They knew now that true love was not an escape from the world, but the courage to build a new one, together. The fire of their reckoning had forged a new reality. In the cool pre-dawn light, still wrapped in the lingering scent of passion and damp earth, they made a pact. The world they had known, with its gilded cages and suffocating expectations, was a world they would leave behind. They would not be prisoners of circumstance, but architects of their own fate. Charles, with a small inheritance from a beloved grandmother, a sum he had guarded for a future he had never dared to imagine, secured passage on a ship to Italy. It was a leap into the unknown, a journey with no certain destination, but it was a journey they would take together. Under the cloak of darkness, Agnes packed a single bag. She left behind her jewels, her fine silk dresses, the tangible symbols of her gilded prison. She took with her only what was essential, a change of clothes, her journal, and the fierce, unwavering love that was now her only compass. They eloped, two fugitives from a world of comfortable misery, choosing a future of uncertainty and art over a lifetime of predictable soul-crushing security. They sacrificed their families, their social standing, their very identities for something infinitely more precious, each other. Months later, the harsh English summer had been replaced by the sun-drenched, honeyed light of an Italian afternoon. Their home was a small whitewashed villa overlooking the sea, its terracotta roof a warm splash of colour against the brilliant, impossible blue of the sky. The air was filled with the scent of lemons and salt, a perfume of freedom and new beginnings. Agnes sat by the open window, a sketchbook resting in her lap, her pencil moving with a graceful, confident ease. Charles sat beside her, a notebook open on the table before him, the ink flowing from his pen in a steady lyrical stream. There was no swing, but the warm breeze that stirred the muslin curtains was a gentle rhythmic push, a soft caress that whispered of the freedom they had found. He stopped writing and looked at her, his heart swelling with a love so profound it was almost painful. She was no longer the sharp-witted, rebellious girl he had met in the garden, but a woman in full glorious bloom, her spirit unburdened, her creativity unleashed. He reached for her hand, the one that was not holding the pencil, and brought it to his lips, kissing each knuckle with a tender reverence. "We are free," he whispered, the words a simple statement of a miraculous truth. She turned to him, her grey eyes, once so full of a shared melancholy, now shining with a fierce and tender love. She smiled, a slow, radiant curve of her lips that held all the joy of their new life. "We are home," she replied. Her embrace was not the desperate, clinging embrace of the folly, but a quiet celebration of a love that had been tested and had not been found wanting. It was a love that was both wild and everlasting, a passion that had found its sanctuary not in a secret corner of a garden, but in the wide, open, sun-drenched landscape of a shared future. They were no longer prisoners, but pioneers, building a new world, a new life, a new home, together. Two bouquets. Nina's flower shop, Bloom and Bough, was not so much a place of business as it was a small, defiant jungle in the heart of Greenwich Village. Tucked into a side street where the city's roar softened to a hum, it was a jewel box of living things. The moment one crossed the threshold, the air changed. It grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp soil, the sharp green perfume of snapped stems, and above all the overwhelming velvet fragrance of roses. It was a chaotic symphony of colour. Delphiniums stood in cobalt blue columns beside the blushing coral of peonies. Ranunculus unfurled in shades of sunset orange and pale buttercup, and in the front window, like a sacred beating heart against the city's grey concrete, blazed the fiery crimson roses that had made her reputation. The shop was warm, personal, and a little wild, a perfect reflection of Nina herself. She had built it from the ground up, a sanctuary born from the ashes of relationships that had burned just as brightly and just as fast as her signature arrangements. Each one had been a grand, passionate declaration, a bonfire of exhilarating highs and gutting lows that had ultimately left her feeling scorched and empty. Her great secret wound was a creeping fear that she was a woman who could inspire only a wildfire, never the steady, life-giving warmth of a hearth. She could sell the dream of lasting love, bottle it in a vase with ferns and baby's breath, but she could not seem to cultivate it for herself. It was this boisterous context that made the weekly order feel like a whisper in a crowded room, a note of stark minimalism in her maximalist world. For 3 months, it had appeared in her online system with the unassailable punctuality of a church bell. Every Friday morning, 7 a.m. on the dot, 12 long-stemmed white roses. No card, no message. The delivery address was a few blocks away. Nameless, faceless, a solemn, unchanging ritual. In the beginning it had been just another order. But as the weeks passed, Nina found herself imbuing the task with a strange reverence. While her other creations were explosions of joy, passion, and celebration, this one felt different. It felt like a prayer. She chose the 12 stems with meticulous care, selecting buds that were just on the cusp of opening, their petals furled tight as secrets. She stripped the thorns with a gentle hand and wrapped their long, elegant stems in simple brown paper, tying them with plain twine. The bouquet was a study in quietude, in graceful sorrow. It was everything her life was not, and it fascinated her. She had built 100 narratives in her head for the anonymous buyer. A grieving widower, a penitent lover, a child honouring a lost parent. Each story was tinged with a melancholy she found both beautiful and unsettling. One particular Friday the city wept. A cold, relentless rain fell from a bruised purple sky, slicking the streets and blurring the lights of passing cars into long watercolour streaks. The bell above her door had been silent for hours, the weather keeping even the most determined romantics at home. Her delivery courier, a cheerful kid named Leo, had called an hour ago. His bike chain snapped, his apologies profuse. Nina had been about to cancel the White Rose order herself when the bell finally chimed. A soft, hesitant sound against the drumming of the rain. He filled the doorway, a tall, sombre man in a dark jacket that was beaded with rain. Water dripped from the ends of his dark hair onto the worn floorboards. He was gaunt, as if carved from something hard and unyielding, and he moved with a heavy stillness that seemed to absorb the shop's vibrant energy, quieting it. For a moment, he just stood there, his gaze sweeping over the riot of colour, a traveller washed up on the shore of a strange tropical land. "Can I help you?" Nina asked, her voice softer than she'd intended. He brought his eyes to her. They were the colour of a stormy sea, and in their depths she saw a profound, familiar sadness. It was a grief she recognised not in its particulars, but in its weight. It was the same hollowed-out look she'd seen in her own reflection after the last spectacular flame-out of her heart. "I believe you have an order," he said. His voice was quiet, a low rumble like distant thunder. "The weekly one, white roses." Nina's breath caught in her throat. This was him, the ghost from her order queue, the silent patron of sorrow. He was nothing like the fragile old man she had sometimes pictured. He was formidable, grounded. The stillness she'd observed was not weakness, but a kind of tightly coiled control, an armour for a vulnerability she sensed was immense. "Yes, of course," she managed, turning to the cooler where the bouquet waited, a pale beacon in the dimming light. She brought it to the counter, the paper crinkling softly. "The courier had to cancel. I was just about to call. I thought that might happen with the weather," he said, not quite meeting her eyes again. He pulled a worn leather wallet from his jacket. His hands were large, his fingers long and deft, but there was a faint tremor in them she might have missed if she hadn't been watching so intently. The air between them was suddenly charged with all the questions she had ever had. Who were they for? Why no card? Why this unwavering, silent devotion? But the questions felt like an intrusion, a clumsy trespass on sacred ground. So she said nothing, merely watched as he paid in cash, the crisp bills cool against her palm. He took the bouquet, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting, inconsequential moment that felt anything but. He held the flowers with a carefulness that spoke of their immense importance. "Thank you," he said, his gaze finally lifting to meet hers again. It was just for a second, but it was enough. Enough for her to see the landscape of loss he carried within him. Then he turned and was gone, the bell chiming his departure, the rain swallowing him back into the grey anonymity of the city. Nina stood for a long time, the scent of rain and roses filling the sudden, profound silence of her shop. The following Friday the rain had passed, leaving behind a city washed clean and bright. Nina found herself glancing at the clock all morning, a nervous flutter in her chest that felt ridiculously adolescent. She told herself it was simple curiosity, but it was more than that. The brief, silent encounter had left an impression, like a photograph developing slowly in the darkroom of her mind. She wanted to see him again. Just after 3 the bell chimed, and he was there. Ethan. He had told her his name the week before, a simple offering in the midst of their transaction. Today, he wore no jacket, just a soft grey Henley that stretched across his broad shoulders. He looked less like a ghost and more like a man, albeit one who wore his sorrow like a second skin. He began picking up the roses in person every Friday. Their conversations were at first as spare and elegant as the bouquets he bought. They spoke of the weather, of a new shipment of Dutch tulips, of the way the light changed in the shop as the afternoon wore on. Each exchange was a carefully placed stone building a tentative bridge across the chasm of their individual solitudes. He never explained the roses, and she never asked. It was an unspoken covenant, a respect for the sanctity of his ritual. One afternoon he arrived to find her perched precariously on a stool, swearing under her breath at her camera. She was trying to photograph a complex cascading arrangement of amaranth and gardenias for her website. But the light was flat, the angle was wrong, and the image on the small screen looked like a pale imitation of the vibrant reality before her. He watched her for a moment, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching the corners of his mouth. "May I?" he asked, his voice gentle. Nina, flustered, nearly dropped the camera. "Be my guest. This thing and I are having creative differences." He took the camera from her, and in his hands the clumsy device became an extension of his own focused stillness. He didn't just look at the bouquet, he studied it, circling it slowly, his body moving with an unnerving grace. He adjusted a single leaf, tilted a blossom a fraction of an inch, and then, with an expert's eye, he moved to the other side of the room. The click of the shutter was a clean, decisive sound. He took only one shot. He handed the camera back to her. On the screen was her arrangement, but it was more than that. He had captured its soul, the play of shadow and light, the delicate droop of a petal, the confident spill of the greenery. It was all there, imbued with a depth and emotion she had failed to find. She breathed, genuinely stunned. "That's perfect. How did you do that?" "It's what I do," he said simply, a flicker of something, pride or perhaps just memory in his eyes. "I'm a photographer." That single frame opened a door between them. He began to linger on Fridays, arriving earlier, staying later. He would lean against the worn wooden counter, nursing a cup of tea she had made him, and watch her work. He rarely spoke, but his presence was a comforting weight, a quiet anchor in the floral chaos of her afternoons. Soon he was helping her close up, sweeping stray leaves from the floor, carrying the heavy buckets of water into the back room. One evening, long after the last customer had gone, with the shop bathed in the soft glow of a few strategically placed lamps, he finally spoke of the roses. They were surrounded by the scent of sleeping flowers, fragrance that was softer, greener than the heady perfume of the day. "There for a bench," he said, his voice low, his gaze fixed on a pale orchid in the corner. "In the park. There's a small plaque on it." He paused, and the silence stretched, filled only by the hum of the cooler. "For my partner. Her name was Sarah. She was a journalist. We were on assignment together." The confession was stark, unadorned, and for that reason devastatingly painful. Nina felt the shape of his loss, a vast empty space. In return, in that candlelit quiet, she offered him a piece of her own vulnerability. I'm surrounded by all of this, she said, gesturing to the vibrant profusion around them, her voice barely a whisper. I sell grand gestures, fiery, passionate, all-consuming love in the form of crimson roses. She looked down at her hands, her fingers stained with green. But I'm terrified of it. I think that kind of love, the kind that burns so brightly, it always burns out. And I'm afraid that's the only kind I know how to inspire. They spoke for hours, of grief and passion as two different languages, one spoken in silences and memorials, the other in shouts and declarations. He saw the world in monochrome and shades of grey truth and hard-won light. She saw it in impossible, oversaturated colour. Later, as they stood by the door, he pulled out his phone. He hesitated, then swiped through a series of images. Nina braced herself for the stark reality of his work, but he scrolled past them. He stopped on one and turned the screen to her. It was not a photo of war or its aftermath. It was a field of wildflowers at dawn, somewhere impossibly green. The light was pale, ethereal, catching the dew on a million tiny petals. It was a moment of such unguarded, breathtaking beauty that it made her ache. I took this the morning before, he trailed off, not needing to finish. It was a picture of the world as it had been, a world that still held the person he loved. As she leaned in to see the details, the soft focus on a single purple bloom, her hand resting on the counter, brushed against his. The contact was a spark, a sudden jolt of warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. It was a silent acknowledgement of the fragile, tenacious life stirring between them, a fragile bloom in the winter of his grief. He didn't pull away, neither did she. The air hummed, thick with the delicate friction between his contained sorrow and her vibrant, irrepressible life force. She found herself studying the lines of exhaustion and sorrow etched around his eyes, and was filled with an overwhelming, previously unimaginable urge to stay, to simply stand with him in the quiet, fragrant dark. The fragile peace they had cultivated in the quiet sanctuary of the shop was not destined to last. The world outside, with its noise and its demands, eventually came calling for Ethan. An old colleague, an editor at a prestigious photography journal, had been hounding him for months to submit his work from that final fatal assignment. It was a portfolio he had buried, both literally and figuratively, on a hard drive in the back of a closet. Finally, worn down by persistence and a small traitorous flicker of professional pride he thought had died with Sarah, he relented. He was nominated as a finalist for the prestigious Allard Prize. With the nomination came a sudden, unwelcome glare of attention. A major magazine wanted to run a feature story. A gallery in Chelsea planned an exhibit showcasing the work of all the finalists. Suddenly, the memories he had so carefully armoured himself against were being printed, framed, and lauded. The images were brutal, honest, a testament to his unflinching eye. They were filled with the noise of chaos, the grey dust of collapsed buildings, the stark, unbearable intimacy of death. He told Nina about the exhibit, his voice carefully neutral, as if discussing a distant acquaintance. He invited her to the opening, an invitation that felt more like a warning. She accepted, her heart a tangled knot of pride for his talent and a deep humming dread. She wanted to know all the parts of him, even the broken ones. She just hadn't understood how sharp those pieces would be. The gallery was a world away from Bloom and Bow. It was all white walls, polished concrete floors and hushed, reverent silence. The air was sterile, cold. Nina, in a simple dark blue dress, felt like an exotic bird that had strayed into a laboratory. She found Ethan's section at the far end of the main room and she stopped breathing. The man who had taken these photographs was a stranger. The gentle, quiet man who helped her sweep leaves and who could capture the soul of a flower was nowhere to be found in these frames. Here was the man who had stared into the abyss. A photo of a small child, face caked in dust, staring with ancient eyes from the rubble of her home. the twisted metal of a bombed-out market, a single bright red scarf snagged on a shard of steel. And the final largest piece, a portrait of a woman, laughing, her face alight with fierce intelligence and joy, a camera slung around her neck. Sarah. The caption beneath it was simple. Sarah Jenkins, near Holmes. It was the last photograph he ever took of her. The violence, the raw, unfiltered despair in the images struck Nina with physical force. It was a language of horror she could not comprehend. This was the ghost he was running from, and seeing it laid bare in stark black and white terrified her. A chasm opened up in her mind, wide and dark, between the man who arranged white roses on a memorial bench and the artist who had captured this unending scream of human suffering. A cold doubt, insidious and chilling, flooded her. Was his heart just a memorial bench, a space dedicated entirely to the past, with no room for new life to grow? Could her small, colourful world ever truly touch his? From across the crowded gallery, Ethan watched her. He had been dreading this moment, this collision of his two worlds. He saw the shock on her face, the way the colour drained from her cheeks. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes as she looked from the photos to him and back again. And in that moment, his deepest, most guarded insecurity was confirmed. His trauma was a contagion. His darkness was a poison that would inevitably extinguish her light. He was toxic. He saw her turn and walk away, swallowed by the crowd without a backward glance. The polite applause for some speech being made on the far side of the room sounded like the roar of an inferno. The next Friday, the 7:00 order for 12 white roses did not come. The silence in her inbox was a definitive damning judgment. Nina waited all day, her hope dwindling with the fading afternoon light. He didn't come. She sent a hesitant text. "Are you okay?" It remained unread. Days turned into a week. Ethan had disappeared. He retreated into the silent grey emptiness of his apartment, the polar opposite of her shop. He was convinced that his withdrawal was an act of kindness, a painful but necessary amputation to protect her from the gangrene of his past. He had allowed himself a brief, beautiful respite in her world of life and colour, but he didn't belong there. He was a creature of shadow, and he had no right to stand in her sun. Nina, meanwhile, misinterpreted his silence completely. To her, it was proof that their connection had been nothing more than a temporary solace for him, a brief stop on his journey of grief, another beautiful thing destined to wilt and die. It confirmed her own deepest fear, that she was only a fleeting passion, a momentary distraction, never the destination. Surrounded by the bold, screaming red of her signature roses, she felt utterly, hopelessly colourless. She had been a fool to believe that love could be a quiet thing. Love, for her, was always loud, and its silence was always the sound of it ending. The night of the Allard Prize ceremony arrived on a wave of frigid November air. Nina knew Ethan was expected to win. The critics had all but declared it. The thought of him standing on a stage celebrated for the very horror that had driven them apart was a bitter pill. For days she had moved through her shop like a phantom, the vibrant colours and scents a mocking reminder of the grey hollowness inside her. But as the evening approached, a familiar, defiant spark began to smouldering within her. It was the same fire that had allowed her to build a life from ashes before. She would not let him disappear into his ghosts. She would not let their story end in a silent, misunderstood retreat. With trembling, determined hands, she began to work. She selected a single perfect red rose. Its petals were the colour of deep arterial blood, velvety and just beginning to unfurl. She placed it in a simple, elegant black vase, its solitary beauty a stark, powerful statement. It was the kind of arrangement she was famous for, the kind that spoke of grand, unequivocal passion. She wrote a simple note on a thick cream card. The red rose whispers of passion. She left the rest of the line unwritten, a question hanging in the air. She called a courier and had it delivered to his table at the awards dinner. It was a final, desperate plea, a reminder of her language, of the world he had briefly inhabited. Ethan saw the rose the moment he sat down. It was an impossible splash of colour in the sea of black tuxedos and glittering gowns. It was Nina. It was her fire, her challenge, her life force, delivered to the heart of his monochrome world. He read the card, the unfinished line a brand on his conscience. He spent the entire ceremony in a haze, the speeches and applause a distant roar. When his name was called as the winner, he moved towards the stage like a man in a dream. He accepted the heavy glass award, his hand closing around its cold, sharp edges. He looked out at the sea of expectant faces, cleared his throat, and spoke into the microphone. "Thank you," he said, his voice clipped and raw. There is no honour in photographing suffering. There is only a duty to witness it. A duty I failed." Before the stunned silence could break, he placed the award on the podium, turned, and walked off the stage. He found her waiting outside, huddled in her coat against the biting wind, her breath pluming in the cold night air. The city lights glittered around them, hard and indifferent. For a long moment they just stared at each other, the space between them humming with everything left unsaid. He spoke first, his voice ragged. "You shouldn't have come." "You didn't give me a choice," she countered, her own voice tight with unshed tears. "You just disappeared. You let me believe I was protecting you," he broke in, his control finally shattering. "Did you see those photos, Nina? Did you see what that world is? It breaks everything and it touches. It broke me. I'm a landscape of ghosts and ruins. I can't drag you into that. I won't let my darkness put out your light." Her anger flared, fierce and righteous. "My light is not that fragile," she cried, taking a step closer, invading his space. "And your darkness isn't who you are. It's what happened to you. I see your wounds, Ethan. I'm not afraid of them. But I am afraid of this silence. I don't want your ghosts or your self-imposed penance. I want you, the man who knows how to capture the soul of a flower, the man who makes me tea and helps me sweep the floor, the man who stood with me in the dark." Her voice broke on the last word. "I am falling in love with you, and you are trying to edit me out of your story like a bad photograph." His face crumpled, the carefully constructed walls of his composure turning to dust. "I don't know how," he whispered, a confession of utter defeat. "I don't know how to be that man for you." "Then let me show you." She closed the final distance between them, rising on her toes to meet his lips. Their first kiss was not gentle. It was a desperate, hungry collision on a cold New York street. It was a storm of grief and hope, anger and longing. It tasted of salt and cold air and the profound, aching relief of a dam breaking. His arms came around her, pulling her tight against him, a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. The fire she had always craved, the grand passion she equated with love, was finally here. But it wasn't the frivolous, fleeting blaze she had known before. This was different. It was a purifying flame born of shared pain and a terrifying, beautiful acceptance. He broke the kiss, his forehead resting against hers, their breath mingling in the frozen air. "Come home with me," he said, the words both a plea and a promise. He took her back to his apartment. As the door swung open, she saw it as she had imagined it, minimalist grey, a space devoid of colour. But for the first time she didn't see it as empty. She saw it as a canvas, a space waiting for life. Their intimacy was a transcendent act of healing. There was no hurry, no frantic grasping. It was a slow, deliberate, reverent exploration, a mapping of scars, both visible and invisible. In the low light of his bedroom he undressed her with hands that trembled slightly, his photographer's eyes tracing the lines of her body as if committing them to memory. She, in turn, met his vulnerability with a fierce tenderness, her fingers tracing the tense line of his shoulders, the faint silvery scars on his back. She kissed each one, a silent vow to love the history written on his skin. This was a surrendering. He, a man who had made his name by seeing, finally allowed himself to be truly seen, his brokenness laid bare, and she, a woman who feared the silence, learned its language. Their bodies spoke what words could not, the slide of skin against skin, the whisper of a name against a throat, the rhythm of their breathing falling into a shared cadence. It was a sensual and deeply vulnerable communion, a physical manifestation of her bringing colour into his grey world and in bringing a profound, steadying depth into hers. He drew her near, their bodies meeting softly with a slow, sacred rhythm. He watched her face, saw the acceptance, the desire, the unwavering love in her eyes, and felt something inside him knit together. It was a reverence for the flesh, a hallowed connection, the body as the soul's most honest expression. In her arms, with her name a prayer on his lips, Ethan realised that love wasn't about forgetting the past or erasing the scars. It was about finding the one person willing to hold the light for you while you navigated the darkness. It was about letting them help you carry the weight. And as Nina held him, feeling the solid, living warmth of him, she understood that the most powerful passion wasn't a sudden blaze that consumes everything in its path, but the unwavering, constant flame that stays lit in the darkest of rooms. In the aftermath, in the quiet of the dawn filtering through the large, bare windows of Ethan's apartment, a new kind of peace settled between them. The world outside remained, with all its demands and its ghosts, but its power over him felt diminished, held at bay by the simple, profound reality of Nina's presence beside him. A week later, he was offered a lucrative, high-profile assignment to document post-conflict rebuilding in Eastern Europe. The old Ethan would have taken it in a heartbeat, seeking the familiar solace of the road, the anaesthetic of the camera lens. This Ethan, the man who had been resurrected in a flower shop, turned it down without a moment's hesitation. He chose to stay. He chose her. Instead, he began a new project, a personal one. He titled it Bloom and Bough. It was a photo series dedicated to capturing the secret, vibrant life of the city that Nina had shown him, the beauty that flourished in the cracks of the concrete. He photographed the early morning light hitting the buckets of flowers outside her shop, the gnarled hands of a woman tending her window box in the West Village, the riot of colour in a community garden in the Bronx. His work found a new voice, a new depth. The stark honesty was still there, but it was now balanced with the tenderness, a reverence for life's stubborn, fragile beauty. The shadow was still present, but now it served only to accentuate the light. Nina's work began to change too. Her arrangements, once defined by their bold, passionate declarations of red, grew more complex, more nuanced. She started incorporating more variety, more subtlety. She wove in the soft blues of forget-me-nots, the gentle lavender of lilac, and even, to her own surprise, the delicate, hopeful presence of pure white roses. Her art was no longer just about the fire. It was about the entire garden, the quiet growth as much as the full, spectacular bloom. Weeks later, on a crisp Friday morning, the bell above her door chimed. Ethan walked in, the early sun catching the silver in his dark hair. He wasn't there for his usual order. His hands were empty, save for his ever-present camera slung over his shoulder. He watched her for a moment, a slow, easy smile spreading across his face, a smile that reached the depths of his storm-grey eyes and calmed the seas. "I have something for you," he said. He hadn't brought flowers, he had come to make them. He moved behind her counter with a newfound familiarity, his quiet confidence a comforting presence in her space. He went to her buckets, the ones filled with the day's freshest offerings, and began to choose stems. His selections were deliberate, his movements as precise and artful as when he held his camera. Nina watched, her heart swelling as he built a bouquet. When he was finished, he turned and presented it to her. It was breathtaking. At its very centre stood a single perfect red rose, its petals a rich, deep crimson. But surrounding it, supporting it, was a soft, cloud-like embrace of a dozen long-stemmed white roses, their pristine petals just beginning to open. It was their two languages, their two worlds woven together into a single harmonious whole. Tucked into the twine was a small cream card, the same kind she had sent to him. On it, in his strong, clean handwriting, was the rest of the line, "And the white rose breathes of love." He had learned to speak both languages. Nina looked up from the impossible perfect bouquet, her eyes shimmering with tears she didn't bother to hide. And he was there, his camera raised, not to document sorrow or capture a fleeting moment of beauty, but to capture her, his forever subject. The woman who was both the fire and the hearth, bathed in the golden morning light of the world they had built together. The shutter clicked, a clean, decisive sound, the sound of a new beginning.